Rick Sterling. First, I want to thank Rick Sterling for agreeing to talk about the constant wars in West Asia. I've known Rick for about 3 decades, working together on NASA instruments at UC Berkeley. And about 16 years ago, I think he pointed me in the right direction for political news, which I was rather poorly educated on. And later, he retired early to become a full-time political activist and journalist. And I still recall that first email from him containing a picture of him with Honduran military pointing machine guns at him as they attempted to mediate conflict over some land while he was down in Honduras. Um, he's written extensively, and our speaker last week, Dan Kovalik, actually wrote about Rick, and I'm just going to read something from Kovalik's book, A Case for Palestine. Journalist Rick Sterling recently penned an article about the issue, and so the issue is how things would have been different if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, arguing that Kennedy would have visited Palestine as a young man in 1939 was very different from any other U.S. president in regard to Israel-Palestine in four different respects. His willingness to deal equally with both Israel and the Arab states, including with the nationalist leader in Egypt, Nasser, his willingness to take on the Israeli lobby by simply enforcing U.S. lobbying laws against Israel as it does against other nations that attempt to exert influence over U.S. politicians, and his support for Palestinian rights, including the right of return, with Kennedy going so far as to criticize the Balfour Declaration, and his willingness and indeed his efforts to prevent Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons. So when we think about like what's going on in the Middle East, you think about if those things had come to pass, how where we would be now in terms of a peaceful West Asia. So at this moment, the crisis hot point has shifted back from Latin America and Venezuela to West Asia, and now our eyes are on Iran and Gaza and Syria and Lebanon. And I looked today to see how this was reflected in headlines, which clearly demonstrate that the U.S. and Israel are again pushing for war. And if you read Al Jazeera, it had a headline, Iran ready for nuclear-focused talks. They're looking to, talk about, they don't, they've indicated they don't want nuclear weapons, but they reject the U.S. military buildup. And but if you go to the Times of Israel, you see Iran is again rules out giving up uranium enrichment and suggests the U.S. not taking the talks seriously. And from the Jerusalem Post, the really right-wing press, Israel warns Trump, we may act alone if Iran crosses the ballistic missile red line, which shows that, that it's not just about missiles, it's just about completely disarming Iran. So with that introduction, I'd like everybody to get ready for Rick, who's very knowledgeable about this. So take it away, Rick.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Jim. Nice to be here with the Green Party, and especially because I really do appreciate what Dr. Jill Stein did, the positions that she took when she's run for president, and I hope she or somebody similarly good is able to run again and get more votes. We've certainly come to a point where an increasing number of people in the U.S. realize the two-party state, or the so-called U.S. democracy, is not very democratic. That the both parties are controlled by oligarchs, by the elite, and regular people have very little say in what happens. And just to follow on that point, I think we've seen some examples in both Honduras and Mexico, which had entrenched political parties which traded power back and forth. And it took a new party to come to power in Honduras after the coup that overthrew Zelaya. His wife, Xiomara Castro, they formed a new party, the Libre Party, and they took power. Now, they recently, in the last election, they lost power partly because of the interference of Donald Trump. But the Libre Party is still there and will be a force in the future. And of course, in Mexico, we had the PRI that had power for decades and decades and decades, and then you had the PAN Party and the PRD Party. But it took a new party, the Morena Party, which is now led by Claudia Sheinbaum, to really change things around and to establish a new policy of independence and sovereignty. And they, of course, are under severe pressure from the U.S. to give up their sovereignty. But in some ways, I think Mexico should be an example. We should look to it as an example of that it is possible to challenge successfully entrenched political elites. So, what's required to do that successfully is a difficult question, but I think it bears a lot more study what it will take. But it's obviously the case that the United States needs a truly independent party, not just one, but it needs several that have a chance at gaining power. So our topic today, when Jim talked with me, or when he asked me about this, I suggested the title, "Why is there constant war in West Asia?" First of all, we call it West Asia now because if you look at a map, you see it's not the Middle East. It's really the west of the Asian continent. It's a huge area that's stretching from the Mediterranean over across the Asian landmass. But if you just look at a map, you can see why it's called that. And when we think about, well, what's the situation in West Asia today? It's really one of conflict, of destabilization, and governments being overthrown by people being impoverished, and a lot of instability. For example, we've got the situation in Gaza, which everybody has seen videos of, the immense destruction, the immense the mass killing, the genocide that's taken place there. And then in the West Bank, you have the settlers, the Zionist forces, which have been increasingly unleashed on the population. And I have a friend there who lives outside of Ramallah, and she reports that she can barely travel to another village, either north or south. So they've got checkpoints distributed throughout the West Bank. It's under attack and assault, and there are people being killed routinely there. In Lebanon, a friend of mine, I was talking last week with a friend of mine who just came back from Lebanon. His village is in the south of Lebanon, and he reports that there are daily attacks there. Now, supposedly, Israel agreed to a ceasefire, but Israel's got a long history of signing ceasefires and not agreeing with them. But my friend Elise tells me that there are drones and there are also attacks from jet fighters on houses, on basically assassination attempts, and the killings of people and the attacks on houses in the south of the country. And the U.S. is putting the squeeze on Lebanon in various ways. It's been under heavy U.S. economic pressure for many years now, and they're able to effectively strangle the economy through sanctions and through putting pressure. And they are doing that, and the U.S. demand, which comes straight from Israel, is that Hezbollah must disarm. So Hezbollah, of course, is the resistance force, which was created because the country was occupied by Israel. And so the Lebanese armed forces weren't very effective. So militias came together and formed Hezbollah. And they were very successful in fighting, and they managed to expel the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis have added in for them ever since. Israel, of course, would like to seize and permanently occupy big parts of southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. So they've got their eyes on that, and they are creating constant destabilization and insecurity in Lebanon, and even attacking Beirut occasionally. But the scene there is of drones flying overhead, both monitoring things and occasionally attacking cars or individuals, as drones are now able to do, or missiles that are fired from overhead jets. Uh, in Libya, just last week, we had the killing of the son of Muammar Gaddafi, and Saif el-Gaddafi was. Some people believed he could be a unifying force. Ever since the overthrow of the Libyan government in 2011, the country's been split in two. Of course, people have probably heard that you saw the emergence of slave markets in Libya when it was totally when it was just got a little distraction here, but when it was under assault, and then I'll have to I don't know if people can see what's on my screen here, but I'll turn this down so I at least don't hear it. Um, so Libya's that used to be have a very high standard of living with a lot of oil wealth. Libya is still a divided country. The standard of living, of course, fell dramatically after the overthrow of the government. Now, the West, which ran this operation, which provided all the support and the air attacks for the fighters on the ground. This was supposed to be the R2P, or responsibility to protect, ironically. So they claimed they were going in and overthrowing the Gaddafi government to support Libyan civilians. And it later on turned out that all their claims about a supposed looming massacre in Benghazi, the city on the Mediterranean coast in Libya, those claims were shown to be lies. It was completely untrue, and the justification, there was no justification. Instead, what you had was the overthrow of a government. You had the plunder of resources. There was a lot of gold and other wealth in Libya, which went who knows where. Probably the French had claimed some of it, probably the U.S. Certainly the U.S. claimed some of it. And we know for a fact that the U.S. claimed a lot of the armaments, and then promptly shipped armaments to support the so-called rebels, i.e., terrorists in Syria. And these, of course, this was Al Qaeda in Syria, and it was shown that it was proven that the weapons, in fact, there were Defense Intelligence Agency documents revealed that provided the explicit evidence that this was going on. So today, Syria is in a different situation. You had the overthrow of the Assad government in December, 14 months ago, and you had coming to power of the al-Shura, or also known as Jolani government. Jolani, of course, was a leader in ISIS and Al Qaeda, and led the Al Qaeda branch in Syria. They were able to build up their forces in Idlib province on the northern border of Syria with Turkey, where they got a lot of support, they got a lot of training, and the infrastructure in Idlib was improved a lot with aid from Western Europe and from Turkey. And they received the military training in use of drones and other aspects of military warfare that are more modern. and they managed to very quickly overthrow the Syrian military, which was very tired from a very long fight, which was very weakened by the intense intense sanctions by the U.S. and by the theft of the oil and the wheat resources of the country. So Syria had a an overthrow of the government. You've got this government now where there's effectively a self-appointed leader, but however he is being recognized by other governments, and they are getting some support from different countries. They're getting support from from Europeans. They're getting support from the U.S. as well as from the Gulf states. Uh, Saudi Arabia, just in the last days, Arabia pledged to invest many billions of dollars in Syria, doing a water desalination project by doing a fiber optic communications network all over the country, by different projects. There's something over 40 different projects, and I believe Saudi Arabia pledged they to invest $10 billion, which would be a huge shot in the arm for Syria, which has suffered so severely by the U.S. sanctions. And a couple of months ago, Trump formally rescinded the so-called Caesar sanctions, which were the ultimate in strangulation of the Syrian economy. So the U.S. was quote unquote successful in bringing down the Assad government, which was a semi-socialist government, which was resolute in saying that they support the Palestinian cause. And for those reasons, it was a target of the West and a target of Israel and a target of the monarchies in the Gulf as well. Um, in terms of Syria, one of the reasons that Trump formally rescinded the U.S. sanctions on Syria is because the Syrian leadership has acquiesced to Israel. Now, the first thing that happened after the Assad government was overthrown is Israel started an intense bombing campaign, and they bombed all of the military outposts, the armament depots, the Syrian Navy. The ships were sunk. The anti-aircraft installations, they were all bombed and attacked. So Syria has no way of defending themselves militarily now. Uh, and but the coup de grace, so to speak, was getting Sharia to say they will almost, I don't know the exact words, but it's almost a peace agreement with Israel, despite that Israel occupies the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory. They're occupying parts of southern Syria now as well. So Israel's occupied Syrian territory and is occupying more and more and taking more and more territory and establishing military bases on more and more of Syria. Yet the Damascus government, which has a heritage in Al Qaeda and ISIS, as I mentioned, they've made peace with Syria. And coupled with that, they have not made peace with Hezbollah. In fact, there's some talk that they may invade parts of Lebanon that are under Hezbollah influence, and so the situation is bad there in many respects. I can understand why the Syrian people just want to be able to feed themselves, and they want to be able to have electricity for more than 2 hours a day. They want to have a normal life, and so that's understandable. But the situation overall has really been very bad. And I remember the first times I went to Syria, I was so impressed with how much how content the people were. They were very content with the Assad government. They liked the standard of living. They liked what was happening there. They liked the fact that it was not a sectarian government. It was a government of all the people and all faiths. So things are very different now. It's divided. It's being occupied by Israel. It's being pressured by both the United States and Israel, and of course Turkey has a heavy hand in there as well. In fact, Shura came into power largely because of Turkey. Another interesting fact that just came up, news broke a few days ago. There were ISIS prisoners who had been imprisoned in Israel. They've been released recently, and it was reported that a convoy of 250 hardcore, hardened ISIS fighters and leaders were being taken by a U.S. Army convoy to Iraq. And that does not augur well for Iraq, because they could form the core of a terrorist force in Iraq and sow a lot of mayhem and death and destruction as they have in the past. Meanwhile, in Yemen to the south, and I'm just kind of reviewing what the situation is in West Asia here. In the south, in Yemen, back a few months ago, Israel managed to bomb the cabinet, the civilian cabinet of the Yemeni government, and kill the entire civilian government. These were not military officials; they were civilian. Then and across the Red Sea from Yemen, you've got Somalia, and you have a breakaway province which is on the coast and they are calling themselves Somaliland. And guess who? Israel has recognized Somaliland to the denunciation of the Organization of African Unity, which very much opposes breakaway republics like this. But in any case, it's obvious what Israel wants to do. They want to get a foothold in that part, in the entry to the Red Sea, from which they could do more attacks on Yemen, and they could divide Somalia even more so. Then, in terms of regional powers, you've got Jordan and Egypt, which are the second and third largest recipients of U.S. aid, not counting Ukraine and the Ukraine war right now. But and that is because of the money that is poured into those countries is to prop up the dictatorships or the monarchy, depending on which country, and keep it in power to keep the control of the militaries to the interests of Israel. And without without that U.S. financial bribery, investment, corruption, whatever you want to call it, without that, both Egypt and Jordan would have very different policies. But these grants, these donations, these military transfers are being done for the sake of Israel. Right now, of course, we've got the extreme threats by the Trump administration against Iran. In December, we had an outbreak of riots and violence that was precipitated because of an economic shock. The currency lost a lot of its value in one night. One prominent bank went bankrupt, and it was Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury of the U.S., who boasted how the U.S. caused this? And so the U.S. has been putting extreme sanctions on Israel for decades, in fact, but they escalated under Trump's first administration, and they escalated more in the spring. And again, Bessent was very proud of the fact that they are making life very hard for the majority of Iranian citizens. In any case, there were protests of the management of the economy because of the disruption of the exchange rate and the problems with the Iranian currency, and that was the pretext for the unleashing of some Mossad and MI6 and CIA trained agents who used those legitimate protests to riot, to attack government buildings, to start killing people on both civilian protesters and police. And several thousand were killed. But ironically, both the U.S. Officials, even U.S. officials, said that they were part of it, as well as some Israeli people acknowledging that the Mossad was there. Of course, they were boasting of this initially because they thought that this would precipitate a bigger uprising and a possible overthrow of the government. And because that is the real goal here, they don't want to mitigate Iran's uranium enrichment. They want to overthrow the Iranian government, and so that is what's going on here. So, in summary about the situation today, you've got many countries destabilized, many countries divided, many countries weakened, many countries corrupted by U.S. military transfers and money, and you've got a number of countries that are under severe threat of more violence to come. Of course, Iran was attacked by Israel as well as the U.S. in June, but they responded effectively enough that in a way, they put the scare in the Israelis because the Israelis ran out of their anti-ballistic missile fire, and they pretty much exhausted their own weaponry with all of their attacks on Lebanon, in southern Lebanon and Gaza. And the Iranian hypersonics especially were devastating to Israel, even though they were very strict in their censorship, and this was not widely publicized, but it was revealed that Mossad headquarters and a lot of other and Israeli bases were successfully attacked by the Iranians. So that's the situation that we have today. How did we get here? I think it goes back to, I mean, there are a number of factors, of course. Oil has been a factor. British goals in the Middle East were a big factor, but a significant factor was the essence of what's happened there, which is basically a settler colonial project was implanted in West Asia, and it's really been a thorn of the side of the region ever since. And not just a thorn in the side, it's been a dominant force. It's been a force which is not willing to compromise, but which demands control and which is demanding ever more control. I don't know if you want to see something interesting, look up the Greater Israel, because the the ultimate goal for Greater Israel goes all the way from the Euphrates to the Nile River. And whether that's, that may be unrealistic, but the simple fact is Israel does keep expanding. They've got no formally defined borders, and they do keep expanding little by little by little. And right today, they're wanting to occupy, and they are occupying parts of southern Lebanon as well as Syria. And now they would love to expel the Palestinians and take complete control of Gaza. Um, of course, as to the origins of the settler colonial project, it's pretty clear that Theodore Herzl said in his, justification in his appeals to British aristocracy, he said that European Jews would be a, quote, outpost of civilization against barbarism, unquote, and, quote, a piece of Europe, unquote, in the Middle East. His goal was to make Palestine a rampart of Europe against Asia. So that was the goal, and that's effectively what it's been. And we can see this has continued to today because Israel continues to be supported by West Europe, by the United States, and by the other settler colonial projects in North America, Canada, and as well as Australia. So it's really the West, the so-called West, which is supporting Israel in its atrocities. If we look at historically in the 20s and 30s, as Jewish immigration to Palestine began, initially there wasn't much conflict, but increasingly there was. And there's a new movie out now called Palestine 36, which documents, I haven't seen it yet, but it's highly rated, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. And I understand that it deals with the conflict in Palestine in 1936 and the conflicts between the Jewish immigrants and the indigenous Palestinians. One thing that's not widely known is that Zionism, it had a different connotation, a different understanding initially, and there were people that called themselves cultural Zionists who did not have the supremacist outlook, the violent, no compromise outlook. People like Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber, the philosopher Martin Buber, they supported immigration to Palestine, but they thought very strongly there had to be equality between the Arabs and the Jews. Albert Einstein said Jewish children should learn Arabic, and they denounced people who were treating the indigenous Arab population with cruelty, with violence, and so forth. When Menachem Begin came to the United States in 1948 to raise support for the Zionist project in Israel, he was denounced in a famous letter to the New York Times, a very lengthy letter. I think it's like 1,200 words. A very lengthy letter that was published in the New York Times. It was signed by 28 prominent Jewish Americans, including Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and different prominent people. And they denounced Begin as carrying out a fascist policy. Nazi-like is the way they described it. And they said that people should not have anything to do with him. So you had a debate within the Jewish community over whether there should be support for Israel. And there was a group, and the group continues to this day, the American Council for Judaism, that was against. Let's see, are you okay? I'm getting a message here. My microphone has changed. Can you hear me?
We can hear
We
you,
can
but you're
still
breaking
hear
away.
you, but we lost the video.
I wonder what happened there. Okay.
There you
Okay.
go. You're back.
Okay.
Okay. Um, uh, so, so I was saying that you had a real split. You had the American Council for Judaism, which was opposed by the Zionist organization, and which opposed them, and they said Jewish Americans are very comfortable in America, and they should have not have a double affinity with another foreign state, and they opposed the Zionists of America, which was the predecessor to AIPAC. Um, so you had a big debate in the both in the Jewish community and in the broader community about the nature of Israel. Unfortunately, the supremacists, the violent faction won out. The people that were led by Jabotinsky, who was a close and Benjamin Netanyahu's father was very closely associated with. They had their approach was that we're not going to be equal to the Arabs. We have to rule over them. There has to be an iron wall of separation. We have to have force. We have to expel them. We cannot live together with them. And so the policy of exclusivism, of supremacy, and of the widespread use of violence, assassinations, attacks, and so forth, that became the really a defining characteristic of Israel and of Zionism. Early examples of it were the blowing up of the King David Hotel that killed dozens of British civil workers in Jerusalem, the murder of Count Bernadotte, who was the United Nations refugees coordinator. They assassinated him, and there's a good book called Rise and Kill First, which documents many of the assassinations, the hundreds and thousands of assassinations that Israel has carried out ever since before its founding, ever since the 1920s and 30s, in fact. Um, how am I doing on time here? So I'm kind of trying to give come up to the present in terms of the context and some of the significant events that happened. Jim mentioned the article that I wrote about the what happened with the assassination of JFK. And it's very likely that the person who was controlling was managing that was James Jesus Angleton, who was a top person in the CIA. In fact, he was in charge of the counter espionage, and he was also the liaison with the Mossad and the Israelis, and he was a staunch Zionist himself. And he would have been acutely aware of how important it was to get Kennedy to kill Kennedy effectively, because Kennedy was demanding that the Zionists of America register as foreign agents, which they were, and he was also demanding that the U.S. Do a close inspection of what was going on at the Dimona nuclear enrichment facility. And the deadline for that was for both of those events was going to be December of 1963. So the timing speaks for itself, how crucial it was. And of course, then LBJ came in. Of course, he had a very different notion both towards Vietnam and also towards Israel. He, in fact, was a Zionist himself. And then so it was with that, since Israel had been successful and they had managed to complete the enrichment and to go nuclear, that emboldened them to launch the Six-Day War in 1967. And they were so emboldened that they attacked the USS Liberty, a communications ship in the Mediterranean. They tried to sink it, and then the idea was to blame it on Egypt and to bring the U.S. into the conflict and also to weaken Egypt and to stiffen their resistance to the Soviet Union as well. So there's a lot of information on that available now. And I noticed even the New York Times is talking about this because this is becoming more and more widely known that the Israelis attacked this ship and tried repeatedly for, I forget exactly how long it was, but they used everything in the arsenal. They used torpedo boats, they used ships, they machine gun people in the water. They killed 34. They injured another 150 or 60 people. It was a massacre, and there's a lot of information. If you're not familiar with it, just look it up, the USS Liberty online, because there's the USS Liberty Veterans Association group that has published some good videos. Continuing on, so that was 1967. Then it's in terms of constant war. It's a constant war. In 1982, of course, the Israelis invaded Lebanon and they occupied Lebanon until they were finally kicked out by Hezbollah. And then in the early 90s, there was some hope with the Oslo Accords, but Israel reneged on its commitment there because they've never truly agreed to a two-state solution to the idea of there being a Palestine, and so they undermined that in a lot of ways. Whatever the agreements were there, they had an excuse to not abide by their own commitments. Another key date is 1998, and that's when Benjamin Netanyahu published his book called Fighting Terrorism. And the crux of the argument, and this is, recall, this is the 1990s. It's the roaring neoliberalism. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and it was going to be the American century was coming up, where the U.S. would rule the world unchallenged. In any case, Netanyahu, in his book Fighting Terrorism, he effectively argued that Israel's got a problem with the Palestinian resistance, with the Lebanese resistance, with people in the Arab states who don't like the supremacist, violent state of Israel as it exists. And he said that what we need to do, or what the Zionists need to do, is they need to get rid of the states that support the resistance movements, whether it's the PFLP or Hamas or whichever Palestinian group, or Hezbollah in Lebanon. Netanyahu argued that that they needed to overthrow Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. If you look at that list, the only one that's still standing effectively is Iran. In any case, this was really the playbook for the neocons to mobilize to label anybody who opposed the Zionist project or the West domination as a terrorist, and they've effectively been able to destabilize or overthrow whatever, to undermine and create the situation that we see today. So I think it's, since that time, of course, you had 9/11. Netanyahu publicly said that 9/11 was, quote, good for Israel, which is kind of a interesting comment, but it's objectively true because it helped to create the conditions where the U.S. could invade Iraq a few years later in 2003, and where they could label Muslims as being terrorists, and so on and so forth, and basically go through that list of countries that I mentioned and undermine, destabilize, and topple many of them. So that's so the So that brings us up to the early 2000s, and since that time, we of course had the invasion of Iraq, the toppling of the Hussein government. We've had the regime change wars in Syria and Libya. We've had the in Sudan, we've had different secessionist movements. In Somalia, we've got the secessionist movement. And by the way, a big part of the argument or a big part of the effort in Iran is because Iran is made up of many different ethnic groups. And so a big part of the strategy of Israel and the West is divide and conquer and to promote ethnic identity over national identity, to promote religious identity over national identity, and to use whatever wedge they can find to undermine national unity. Uh, they will have a harder time with doing that in Iran because Iran has been effectively, the same country for many, many centuries, and also much of the leadership of Iran is from diverse ethnic groups. So it's not just one predominant ethnic group. Um, and and so I think they're going to have a hard time on that. And um, the So Iran effectively showed that they can punch back last June, and in some ways, some people believe that it was Israel and the U.S. that was really pressing and which really needed a ceasefire or an end to the conflict in June. But we do know that Netanyahu is coming to Washington on Wednesday. Netanyahu, of course, has been wanting the U.S., not Israel, but wanting the U.S. to destroy Iran, to bring about regime change in Iran, to destroy Iran as a possible challenger to Israel in West Asia. There's many, probably everybody's seen the famous cartoon of Netanyahu with a cartoon of a bomb, and he's showing it. They've enriched it to 90%. And this story of Netanyahu that Iran is just weeks away from a nuclear bomb and is a big threat, and therefore we have to go take it out. Uh, the irony, of course, is that the only one with nuclear weapons in West Asia is Israel, and that fact. I mean, they're the fact that they're the sole possessors of nuclear bomb. In a lot of ways, it would be a lot safer if Iran had a nuclear bomb, and Israel would have to change its behavior a little bit, but that doesn't exist now, and I think Iran is. They're under a religious edict that against the creation of a nuclear bomb. And what they are, in terms of the negotiations right now, they are willing to make an agreement, which is basically like the JCPOA that was negotiated by numerous countries, which was agreed with by the United Nations Security Council. After long negotiations, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it restricted Iranian uranium enrichment to I think 3%, and it allowed for monitoring and inspection, and it was all being complied with. But because Netanyahu's goal is not just to prevent them from getting a nuclear bomb. Netanyahu's goal is to overthrow the government. And because, like he said in his book, Fighting Terrorism, they consider anybody who supports the Palestinian resistance or the resistance to Zionism and Western domination, Western imperialism, they consider that to be terrorists. And so no matter what kinds of atrocities they do, they'll say they're justified. But I think so. In summary, I think it's a critical time right now. Western imperialism and colonialism, in some ways, are embodied in Israel, and the question comes up is how much of international law is going to be left if Israel is able to act with this level of impunity? And a very good statement that I just learned about this morning was made by the foreign minister of Iran, Araghchi, who was in Doha for the Qatar Forum, I believe it's called, and or he was in either Doha. Yeah, I think he was in Doha, and it was a Al Jazeera. Perhaps it was an Al Jazeera forum. In any case, it's got a lot of high-level officials, and I'd like to conclude by showing this because I think I think people will get a lot from it. It's just an 11-minute presentation by the Iranian foreign minister, but if you hear that the Iranians are about to buckle, or that they're unreasonable, or if you hear these things, I think you'll find it very interesting to hear straight from the foreign minister of Iran what he has to say. So I'll share this video, and then afterward, look forward to 15 minutes of questions.
It may be a little more than 15 minutes, Rick, unless you want to summarize I think you might have more
Yeah.
than that, but so.
Okay, let's see now. Uh, 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 okay.
Of our region, Palestine. Let me begin with the fact that the region has learned through decades of painful experience, and that the world is learning again at a terrible human cost. Palestine is not one issue among many. Palestine is the defining question of justice in West Asia and beyond. It is the strategic and moral compass of our region. It is a test of whether international law has meaning, whether human rights have universal value, and whether global institutions exist to protect the weak or merely to rationalize the power of the strong. For generations, the Palestinian crisis was understood primarily as the consequence of an illegal occupation and the denial of an inalienable right, the right of a people to self-determination. But today, we must recognize that the crisis has moved far beyond the parameters of occupation alone. What we are witnessing in Gaza is not merely war. It is not a conflict between equal parties. It is not an unfortunate byproduct of security measures. It is the deliberate destruction of civilian life on a massive scale. It is genocide. The human cost of Israel's atrocities in Gaza has wounded the conscience of humanity. It has torn open the heart of the Muslim world, and it has also shaken millions beyond it, Christians, Jews, and people of all kinds, all faiths, who still believe that the life of a child is not a bargaining chip, that starvation is not a weapon, that that hospitals are not battlefields, and that the killing of families is not self-defense. Palestine today is not simply a tragedy. It is a mirror held up to the world. It reflects not only the suffering of Palestinians, but also the moral failure of those who had the power to stop this catastrophe and choose instead to justify it, enable it, or normalize it. But Palestine and Gaza is not only a humanitarian crisis. It has become the platform for something larger and more dangerous, an expansionist project pursued under the banner of security. The project has three consequences, each of them profound, each of them alarming. The first consequence is global. The Israeli regime's conduct in Palestine and the impunity granted to it have deeply damaged the international legal order. We must say this clearly. The world is moving toward a condition where international law no longer is respected and governs international relations. What is perhaps most dangerous is the precedent being established that if a state has sufficient political cover and protection, it may bomb civilians, besiege populations, target infrastructures, assassinate individuals across borders, and still demand to be regarded as lawful. This is not merely a Palestinian problem, it is a global problem. We are witnessing not only the tragedy of Palestine, but the transformation of the world into a place where the law is replaced by force. The second consequence is regional. Israel's expansionist project has had a direct and destabilizing impact on the security of all countries in the region. The Israeli regime now openly violates borders. It breaches sovereignties. It assassinates official dignitaries. It conducts terrorist operations. It expands its reach in multiple theaters. And it does so not discreetly, but with a sense of entitlement, because it has learned that international accountability will not come. Let us be candid. If the Gaza issue is settled through destruction and forced displacement, if that becomes the model, then the West Bank will be the next. Annexation will become policy. This is the essence of what has long been called the Greater Israel. The question, therefore, is not whether Israel's actions threaten Palestinians alone. The question is whether the region will accept a future in which borders are temporary, sovereignty is conditional, and security is determined not by law or diplomacy, but by the ambitions of a militarized occupier. The third consequence is structural, and perhaps the most dangerous. Israel's expansionist project requires that neighboring countries be weakened, militarily, technologically, economically, and socially, so that the Israeli regime permanently enjoys the upper hand. Under this project, Israel is free to expand its military arsenal without limits, including weapons of mass destruction that remain outside any inspection regime. Yet, other countries are demanded to disarm. Others are pressured to reduce defensive capacity. Others are punished for scientific progress. Others are sanctioned for building resilience. Nobody should be confused. This is not arms control. It is not non-proliferation. It is not security. It is the enforcement of permanent inequality. Israel must have a military, intelligence, and a strategic edge, and others must remain vulnerable. This is a doctrine of domination. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why the Palestinian question is not only a humanitarian issue, it is a strategic issue. It is not only about Gaza and the West Bank, it is about the future of our region and the rules of the world. So what must be done? It is not enough to express concern. It is not enough to issue statements. It is not enough to mourn. We need a coordinated strategy of action. Legal, diplomatic, economic, and security-based, rooted in the principles of international law and collective responsibility. First, the international community must support legal mechanisms without hesitation. Second, there must be consequences for violations. We call for comprehensive and targeted sanctions against Israel, including an immediate arms embargo, the suspension of military and intelligence cooperation, restrictions on officials, and banning trade. Third, we need a credible political horizon grounded in law. The international community must affirm the end of occupation, the right of return and compensation in accordance with international law, and the establishment of a unified and independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Fourth, the humanitarian crisis must be treated as a matter of urgent international responsibility. Collective punishment must never be normalized. Fifth, regional states must coordinate to protect sovereignty and deter aggression. The principle must be clear. Security cannot be built on the insecurity of others. And finally, the Islamic world, the Arab world, and the nations of the global South must build a united diplomatic front. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, and the regional organizations must move beyond symbolism toward coordinated action, legal support, diplomatic initiatives, economic measures, and strategic messaging. This is not about confrontation. It is about preventing the region from being reshaped by force. Dear colleagues, let no one miscalculate. A region cannot be kept stable by allowing one actor to act above the law. The doctrine of impunity will not produce peace. It will produce wider conflict. The path to stability is clear. Justice for Palestine, accountability for crimes, an end to occupation and apartheid, and a regional order built on sovereignty, equality, and cooperation. If the world wants peace, it must stop rewarding aggression. If the world wants stability, it must stop enabling expansionism. If the world believes in international law, it must enforce it consistently and without double standards. And if the nations of this region seek a future free from perpetual war, they must recognize this fundamental truth. Palestine is not merely a cause for solidarity. It is the indispensable cornerstone of regional security. Thank you so much for your attention.
So that was Foreign Minister Arugshi just yesterday, 24 or 36 hours ago, coming from their negotiations going on between Iran and the United States taking place in Oman. They aren't meeting person to person, but they've got some mediators from different countries that are kind of shuttling between the two sides. But from the speech there, you can see that Iran is not planning to bow down. So I'll be looking. Look forward to
some Q&A here.
Yeah, sure.
So if you have a question, put up your hand in the and we'll call on people in roughly order your hands raised, and we'll although we may alternate if too many people of one type raise their hands. And while we're waiting for people to raise their hands, I'm gonna ask the first. I'll ask two quick questions that you think you can get to. One, do we know what ever happened to the Libyan gold after the NATO invasions? And along that same line, has the new Syrian government obtained any sovereignty over its oil and wheat?
Okay, on Libyan gold, I don't know what happened to it. It was stolen. Who stole it? I don't know. It could be the U.S., could be France, could be. My guess is it would be a NATO force of one type or another. Might have been the CIA might have had their hand in it. And so, what was the other question?
Has the new Syrian government obtained any sovereignty over its oil and wheat, which, had been being stolen from the Assad government?
Right, right. I'm not sure of the details on that. As some people will know, the U.S. gave the green light to the Damascus government taking control of eastern Syria, where the Kurdish group had been protected by the United States. And so once again, the Kurds have, you know, uh, they've made this mistake of seeking an independence in a sectarian fashion, and they've looked to other parties to protect them, and then the other parties, in this case the United States, changed their mind and dropped their protection. So they're being forced to come to some kind of agreement with the Shura government. Now there were some deaths recently, but I'm not sure. It may be that the United States is sharing the resources with the Shura government now. That would be likely, given that the Washington is seeking to prop up and to promote Shura government. But So my guess is that they are sharing more and more of the resources, but the U.S. is probably, given Trump's pension, is probably keeping a good chunk of the resources as well, or the money that's gained from the resources of the wheat, the sale of the wheat and oil.
We have a question in the chat from Nikki. It says, Rick, what is your proposal to help bring about peace in West Asia and around the world? That's an easy question, right?
Well, it actually is easy. The world needs to step in and deter, if not overthrow, the Zionist regime. I mean, you've got a fascist government that is creating chaos for decade after decade. I mean, you've got a genocide going on now, where, just like Arauchi was saying, they bomb hospitals, they bring about starvation, they bring about death by from the cold. So with impunity. So I think really it would be very big right now, and I think Arauchi is saying that the Palestine issue is really it goes way beyond Palestine, because it does come to the issue of sovereignty, of support, of violence, instead of negotiation and compromise and diplomacy. And Israel's policies of defying the United Nations, thumbing their nose at international law, doing whatever they want, with just blatant forms of violence, and getting away with it. It's really uh, undermining the world in so many ways. So I think that would be a huge thing if the U.S. and well, not the U.S., but basically if the world, one way or another, was to step in and bring about regime change in Tel Aviv, not Tehran.
We got a couple hands up. Bill, you want to go first? And everybody try to keep your questions relatively short, without, not more than 2 minutes.
Okay. Thanks, James. And thank you, Rick, for really many insights. I have two questions. One, going back in history, since we might take the long view, and that's why, with so many promising examples of a uh, Middle Eastern Arab um, nationalist movement, whether it be in Egypt, whether it be in Syria and Iraq, that things were not able to work out in terms of a project that they could uh, impose in terms of the region. I know that seems way back, but it's not all that far back. And more contemporary, uh, in terms of Israel, and by the way, people should realize about Jabotinsky that he functioned in Germany till what was it, 40 or 41, in terms of working with the Nazis. But that's another story. How do you see, with for all the triumphalists, how do you see the Zionists functioning with so many economic problems, with people fleeing outside of the area? Um, you know, can they maintain this even with or without U.S. support? So it seems to me the Zionist project is in big trouble, despite what many people may think. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And I think regarding the nationalist governments such as Nasser in Egypt and Assad in Syria, they were able to achieve some level of success and a lot of popularity, but at the end of the day, they were the forces of opposition were just greater. I mean, in the case of Nasser, the devastation of Egypt by Israel with the surprise attack in June 1967, of course, was a huge blow to him, and Assad. It was just a long slog. The war. I mean, they were at war for 14 years, and being impoverished economically, and not getting the support from Russia that they would have liked at the end, partly because Russia's got its hands full with Ukraine and fighting NATO there. But they were not able to prevail because of overall circumstances. The West has effectively used the divide and conquer. Of course, after the 1979 revolution in Iran, it didn't take long before the U.S. was promoting Iraq and Saddam Hussein to seize Iranian land and launch the devastating Iran-Iraq war that took most of the 1980s. So, in terms of how the Zionists function and what can be done, I think the world is it's been obvious to many people around the world for a long time. And Latin America, I do some work around Latin America, and progressive Latin Americans have been very clear about Israel for many decades, because Israel, of course, supplied the El Salvador death squads with weapons. And Hugo Chavez, was outspoken at the United Nations in denouncing Israel, and that's another reason why Israel, of course, has so much influence on Donald Trump, and probably played a supportive role at the very least in the attack on Venezuela. They would like to have regime change in Caracas for various reasons, but a big one is because Venezuela has been a staunch supporter of the Palestinians, and also has been a staunch ally of Iran. So I think it's a long-term project. I think it'll take the world getting more outspoken. It seems like with the elections in Europe coming up and the unpopularity of the elite currently running the European Union and so many countries in Europe, and getting very unpopular with the public at large, you're going to see the governments losing control, and I think you're going to see more and more governments that are very critical of the way things have gone, both in the supporting the proxy war in Ukraine and also blindly supporting Israel no matter what they do.
Vicente, you want to go?
Thank you. Actually, I also have a clarifying question in the sense that, if I heard it right, what would be, again, your suggestion on how to do regime change in Israel? And then my actual question is piggybacking, do you think that we can create these changes within the current system, or do we need to completely change and restart again, or what are your suggestions? Thanks.
Regime change in Israel, of course, it'll depend to a significant extent on Israelis. But 20% of the Israeli population are Arab. They're second-class citizens, but they have full Israeli citizenship. And so, of course, they would be very supportive of regime change. Unfortunately, the polling numbers indicate that while many Israelis are vehemently opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu, they are a lot less critical of the IDF and the genocide project in Gaza. So I think it's going to take changes there, but it may be. I mean, ideally you would have some means of, well, a starting point, an obvious starting point is to really escalate and catapult the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. Just a couple of days ago, they had big strikes in Italy and in many other ports where the dock workers refused to load ships that were taking armaments, not just to Israel, but overall. So they had a message that was against war and specifically against Israeli genocide. So actions like that, I think, need to escalate. It'll take a lot of international pressure. The international pressure against apartheid South Africa was significant, was very helpful. Of course, the core of the opposition was the African National Congress, and the indigenous people are going to be there. But if you take the people in Gaza, you take the people in the West Bank, and you take Arab Israelis, and you take some percentage of Israelis who want peace and equality and are willing to compromise and don't believe in a supremacist state, you've got a majority of the population that way. I was there in 2007 and very happy to participate in a demonstration in Tel Aviv. I was living in the West Bank, but they invited activists to come to Tel Aviv and participate in this big demonstration. And there were a lot of young Israeli families that were denouncing Israel. They were saying you can't be democratic and Jewish at the same time. It's one or the other. Either you're a Jewish supremacist state or you're a democratic state. You can't be both. So I think it'll take a lot of international pressure. At some point, force may be required. And that could be justified because if you think of fascism as fascist characteristics as ultra nationalist, ultra violent, and believing in ethnic supremacy, Israel is very high on all of those characteristics. And as to its apartheid policies, Both Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli B'Tselem all did independent, extensive reports and research, and all of them concluded Israel is an apartheid state.
Next question, CJ482. Want to unmute and ask your question?
I want to thank you for the information that we have. Thanks to you, we can digest it, figure it out, and also know otherwise we would not have this information. Thank you.
Okay, you can go on. Yeah, we all need to thank Rick. Daniel, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. In these last few weeks, we've been watching Trump threaten Iran. Trump and Israel threaten Iran, and at this point, it looks like Trump is afraid to attack Iran. That Iran may be harder to crack than they thought. And Trump is out on a limb there. He's got to show some sort of a big victory that he won something. There doesn't seem to be much he could win in that place. Maybe some sort of nuclear deal, which would effectively mean, I guess it'd probably mean very little, but that might be a part of it. But he would have to do something to show that he's the strong man. So I kind of wonder if what he'll do is to cover this up is to go and attack Cuba in some way. Maybe make a major attack on Cuba or some other place, some place that he can show that he's a winner. He's got to move off and attack somebody and come off looking like a winner. How do you see that?
I see it very similar to you, Daniel. I think Trump realizes that getting in an extended war with a lot of U.S. deaths is not going to help him. He's also thinking ahead 9 or 10 months to the midterm elections, and surely realizes that a lot of people voted for him because he claimed to be a peace president and to be against forever wars. So the idea of getting in a protracted war with Iran, which is a much bigger country. I mean, it's almost the size of West Europe. It's 93 million people. It's a much bigger country, and it's much more able technologically, and they're getting support from China and Russia. So he's going to realize that this could be very difficult. I mean, how long were we bogged down, or how long was the United States bogged down in Afghanistan? And so he's going to realize that. So I think I agree with you. He would like some kind of a showy, splashy action that he could try to sell as a great victory. He's going to have a hard time doing that because the Iranians have said, we're not going to go light like we did last time. If you attack us, we're going to attack U.S. bases, which are scattered all over the West Asia, and we're also going to attack Israel. So I think Trump is very wary. He's probably losing sleep over this one. What do I do? You're suggesting that he might do an action against Cuba. I think I haven't heard that before, but it seems like it's plausible. And he may try to just back out without, of course, saying so. I think he's going to be very wary about getting into a serious conflict with Iran. On the other hand, Benjamin Netanyahu's been trying to provoke this for decades, literally. And from Netanyahu's perspective, they've got some big victories. They've weakened Hezbollah greatly. They've overthrown the Syrian government. They've got a government in there now which is coming to an agreement, and which has no military to defend itself against a foreign power. They can overfly Syria en route to Iraq and Iran now. Israel can. So Benjamin Netanyahu thinks that he may well think that now is the time. We know he has enormous influence or power over Trump, and he's coming to the White House on Wednesday. So we'll just have to see what happens after that.
Rick, I'm going to follow up on that. This is something I think a lot of people have asked me, and how effective do you think the Israeli lobbying is? Do you think this is a case of the tail wagging the dog? And it's not just that the Israeli lobby itself, but there may be blackmail through Epstein, and because on this side, we have the Zionist neocons who are clearly pushing the same policies, but the number of Zionist neocons is a small percentage of the U.S. population, even though they sit in a lot of think tanks. There's a lot of people that just think this is a case of tail wagging the dog, but maybe it's just our interests are aligned, and that's all that it is. So, what do you think?
Well, I think people who see Israel as a tool of U.S. imperialism, I think that's a pretty narrow vision. I think it was set up, as I outlined at the beginning. I think it was set up by British imperial forces looking to an idea to influence and control the area. But little by little, Israel has gone its own way, and in fact, in the 90s, there was a paper that explicitly talked about about Israel not being dependent on the U.S. And of course, they are dependent on the U.S., but the fact that they can control Congress to the extent that they do, and it's not just, of course, the Zionist neocons are a tiny fraction of the population. They're a tiny fraction of people who work in the foreign policy field, but they're Zionist billionaires as well. And the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu was able to get so many standing ovations from Congress, the fact that when Obama was president, Netanyahu could come here in direct defiance of Obama and still get standing ovations at Congress, and the fact that Trump had Sheldon Adelson and Miriam Adelson to the White House, and he talked about how angry Adelson was and why they had to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem under effectively Adelson's orders. This is a measure of the power. I had an interesting experience back about 10 or 12 years ago. At the time, the congressional representative in Walnut Creek was John Garamendi, and with a friend, we went to New York. We met with his chief of staff, and they invited us to meet with them. It wasn't we were asking them. They invited us to come in because we had working with a peace group in Walnut Creek. We had criticized Garamendi for backtracking on something that he had done. In any case, the interesting point was that this chief of staff told us that they were sick of the Zionist lobby coming into their office every week. They couldn't say so publicly, and they wouldn't say so publicly. In fact, the Zionist lobby forced or pressured Garamendi to remove his name from a letter that had been drafted by and signed by 45 or 50 Congress people about the situation in Gaza. And this is back in This is probably in might have been in 2009 or 10. Anyway, the interesting thing to me was this person's really his anger, the fact that the congressman had to submit, had to have his name removed, but their, silent anger about it. So I think there's a lot of that. Of course, and so many more people are aware of how dangerous and bad the Zionist lobby is, and of course the divide in the U.S. public, the increasing opposition to Israel, including among in the Jewish American population. So that just needs to grow many times more and become much more active.